good to get an invitation to come to Nebraska. So I want to thank Jessica for the invitation to come speak to you. My wife, Louise, and I wanted to make a journey to Nebraska to visit some of the libraries that I have funded over the years. You know, I have funded over 68 libraries in Nebraska with Norfolk being one of them. I understand that the application to get one of our funding resources took a little while for you. I understand that you made an application in 1901, 1902, 1906, and then finally in 1908. And then that's when we accepted the application and you received $10,000 to buy, to build the library, at least to get it started. Yes, I mean, that was quite a lot of work for the Women's Club of Norfolk. So I think we owe a big round of applause to that group for spending so much time and effort to be able to get the application going and get that into James Bertram, my secretary, so that we can make the gift of $10,000. We're comfortable in this building. I noticed the design of this building is a little bit different than many of the designs that I've been a part of. And by the way, that was one of the application requirements, that there was a certain look to the libraries that we wanted. But I understand over the years, times the library gets out of size and you need to rebuild and so on and so forth. So I surely understand that. November 25th, 1835, my father was named William, and he was a damask weaver. Does that ring a bell? Damask? Okay, cotton and linen, and it's weaved in a very, very unique pattern. It gets the name damask weaving. And he had looms, and we lived in basically a two-story house, but our room was on the top floor, and the bottom floor, that's where the loom was. And that's what my father did for a living. Now, in the early days, from 1835 to the 1840s, he made a very, very good living. And my mother's name was Margaret. And Will, as they called him, was able to make a good income and take care of us. Unfortunately, the steam engine was created. And as a result of that, all those people that had these hand looms now found themselves being worked out of a job by the Industrial Revolution. So now he couldn't make a living doing his damask weaving because now it could be done on a machine. And as a result of that, our family went into poverty. And as a young boy, even at the ages of 8 or 9, I became obvious that the fact was that I was going to have to help bring in an income into my family. So what did we do? Well, my mother decided to take that bottom floor of our house and then turn it into a little convenience store, if you want to call it that. And she'd sell all kinds of things that would be valuable to people. And she also had learned from her grandfather how to mend shoes. And so people would bring their shoes to the house and my mother would take care of them. Now, so here I have this increasing pressure to be a provider for a family, and I'm barely 10 years old. A story that I heard people talk about me to kind of give you an attitude that I had. I was a very small boy, mind you, and I would be required in the morning, when we got up in the morning, to go down to the water well with our bucket and get the fresh water for the day. And so I would take my bucket and would go down. It would be 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning, be relatively dark. And I would notice that the water well would have all of these cans lined up, all in a row, but no one standing there. And it occurred to me that the other women in the town had brought their water buckets and set it in a row so that they could come down later and get in line where their bucket was in order to fill their water. Well, I would walk down there maybe 30 minutes later. I see all these buckets and I'm going, that's not right. So I simply moved their buckets, took my bucket, filled it up with water, and continued to walk back home. Well, the ladies found out what I was doing and they said I was an awful laddie. That kind of shows you some of the beginning attitudes that I developed that have been able to do that. The only other telegrapher that I know that accomplished that goal was a woman about 2 or 3 years later that worked for the same telegraph company as me. But I picked up a skill of being able to translate without having to write it down. And as a result, I became very popular with a lot of the people that were picking up the telegraph situations. They would actually want me to deliver to them. And then as a prize, if I did a good job and got to them quickly, they'd give me a dime extra. Now all the other telegrapher boys would also get dimes, and we would pool our dimes, and I was the treasurer, you see. And we'd pool our dimes, and then at the end of the month, we'd go out and celebrate, do something with it. Now another priority and a gift that I received because of my working, I was able to memorize the street names and the buildings of all the people I was delivering to. Now mind you, when I'm working at the telegraph office, I was going in at 6 o'clock in the morning, and sometimes I wouldn't get home till 7 o'clock at night. It's now dark. So that means I was going and delivering things in the early morning or in the evening, and you had to know where you were going. There weren't necessary lighting that you'd be able to figure it out. So my memory had to be very, very good. And as a result of being such a good delivery boy, the businessmen would give me free tickets to the opera and the theater. And so I got to sneak in on Shakespeare performances. And I thought, wow, that's fantastic. And I got plays and Wagner concerts, Lohengrin. 14 years old, I'm picking up on all this. And I got so interested in it, I decided, well, you know, I only have a couple of years of school, so in the evening when I go home, I'd read whatever I get my hands on. And I read everything. And so reading became very, very important to me, and I had to really kind of self-educate myself. Well, after my experience as a telegrapher, a man by the name of Thomas Scott, who was superintendent of the Pennsylvania Railroad, found out about me and said, Andy, would you like to come and work for the railroad and be my personal secretary? And I thought, well, this is wonderful. Yes. And he said, your salary will now be $35 a month. Well, that's significantly better than $2 a week. And I'm saying, this is really nice because I can take this money back home and really help my mother and father and Tom live a life. And as a result, I worked for Thomas Scott and learned the railroad business. But see, I had a telegraph situation, and the railroads at this time were now putting up telegraph lines along the railroads, because in those days, the Pennsylvania Railroad running east and west had one track, and trains were going this way and then had to turn off and another train going that way. But if you had a telegraph line, you could indicate times and places so the train could be altered, and so you could actually run trains 24 hours a day. And I made it possible for Thomas Scott to radically change the Pennsylvania Railroad and make it an extremely profitable situation. Now mind you, ladies and gentlemen, this is about the 1850s and the 1860s. When the Civil War comes around, the railroad was significant in the way of moving troops and ammunition. And as a result of my work there, by the 1860s, I found myself being promoted to actually working the Western District of the Pennsylvania Railroad, and now I'm in my 20s. And now my salary is increasing even further. Now, officers and soldiers in retreat at Bull Run. And we repaired the lines, and we picked up soldiers. Remember, in that battle, it was a terrible defeat for the Union Army. And it was well, by the way, I will let you know that I was injured. I went out to repair a telegraph line. It was a very hard wire. It popped up and scratched my face, and I was bleeding. And so Mr. Scott came up to me and said, Mr. Carnegie, you're going to be one of the first casualties of the Civil War. So I did make a contribution to the war effort. And by the way, the railroad and the telegraph were significant to the success of the Union. So as I was having these experiences, and as I told you, I would work my 12-hour days, 10-hour days, whatever. I would come home, I would provide resources to mother and father, and then I would read. And this is where I got my first interest in the concept of a library. Because my father, when we were in Scotland, I remember him collecting books and providing them to boys of my age and even older And they would come by my house, and my father would loan them a book, and they would go take the book and read it, come back and exchange it for another one. So the idea of a book exchange was something my father initiated. But what it really came down to was I found out by a man by the name of Anderson, Colonel James Anderson in Pittsburgh. He had an idea of expanding this idea of loaning out books. And he was a wealthy man, probably a War of 1812 veteran, if I remember correctly. And he had a beautiful house, and he had a big library of over 400 books, everything you could think of. And he would allow us working boys to come to his house on a Saturday night, and we could take out a book, and then we could read it, and then bring it back next Saturday for an exchange. And so that was really the beginnings of my thinking about the importance, obviously, of reading, because that's how I got myself educated. But the idea of a basically free type of book experience. Keystone Telegraph Company, I invested in the Columbia Oil Company. There was a man by the name of Rockefeller. And I found out with $1,000 interest, I could get involved in this well that they were drilling. And by the way, that $1,000 turned into a $10,000 dividend later on. I then found out that when I got into the bridge business, the bridges at that time were made of iron. And you know, iron is not as strong as this new device called steel. And so, having read up on it, I decided to get in the bridge business, and we had all these wooden bridges that were falling down. And we were replacing them with iron, but iron, again, was hard to work with, and they started looking at developing steel. So I read about Henry Bessemer, back in England, who created a process for making steel very, very cheaply, but very fast. And so I actually took a boat back to England, met the guy, looked at his plans, brought it back to the United States, and went to this bridge company and said, I have this idea. We ought to start producing steel from your iron. The man said, that's a pretty good idea, and I invested my money in it. As a result, we could make steel 10 times faster than anybody else. And so that was the beginning of my involvement in the steel industry. And I didn't have any other background other than taking this idea, the Bessemer process, and then bringing it to people that knew what was going on, other people that were very knowledgeable in the steel business, and I got started there. By 1901, I know you're not going to believe this. In 1901, I decided the steel business, I had created Carnegie Steel. I had purchased other steel companies in the area, and I decided in 1901 that I'm going to get out of the business. I was tired of making money. And so my secretary came up to me and he said, well, J.P. Morgan, you know J.P. Morgan? Banker, New York? J.P. Morgan was interested in buying my steel company. He wanted to create United States Steel. And so my secretary came up to me and said, oh, Mr. Carnegie, how much would you be willing to offer for Mr. Morgan to buy the company? And so he said, you have a piece of paper? He handed me a piece of paper, and I thought about it for a minute. Wrote on it, $480 million. He went over to Mr. J.P. Morgan, handed it to Mr. Morgan, and said, Mr. Morgan, this is Mr. Carnegie's offer. Morgan took a look at it. 5 minutes later, said, deal. I met Mr. Morgan soon after that. He came up to me and shook my hand and said, Mr. Carnegie, congratulations, you're the richest man in the world. I went from $1.20 a week to $480 million in 1901. Now you figure out what that would be worth today. Yes, I was the richest man in the world. Was I happy? Well, yes. I lived long enough with my mother. My father passed away in his 40s, probably from depression. I never knew exactly what the cause was. My brother Tom went in business with me. Unfortunately, he became an alcoholic, and he died suddenly. And then I told my mother that I would stay with her for as long as she lives, and I will not marry until you pass on. My mother didn't trust any of the women I liked. So I said, okay. Now, during that time period, I had met Louise Whitfield in New York. Now, we were living in New York now. We lived in Pennsylvania for a while, but it was a nasty place to live, the soot, smoke, and the dirt and grime and all that. So we moved to New York and had a nice mansion right next to this big park, Central Park. And so here I'm in the house, and my mother contracts pneumonia. My brother had died. She died suddenly. And now both of them are gone. And Louise was a young woman I had met 10 years ago. And I kind of kept her out there in my mind. She was much younger than me. I think about 15 years or so younger. And so I thought about it. And so I had told her that we're not getting engaged until my mother passes. She passes, and I immediately go to Louise and said, well, Mom's gone, and I think it's about time for us to get married. So we got married. And we were living in New York, and actually it was Louise who really kind of got me interested in retiring from all the business world. And it's really interesting, you know, when you have a lot of money like that, and you're involved with steel business, you get all kinds of people coming up to you in the middle of New York asking you for money and things. I had one time, here's a story that I think is very interesting. One day, after selling Carnegie steel, I was approached by a socialist in downtown New York who was preaching against capitalism and my possession of so much money. And he wanted a more equitable share of my wealth. And so he came up to me and he was giving me a hard time about that. And then I asked my secretary, who was with me, and I said, would you, Mr. Secretary, would you write down on a piece of paper the value of my possessions, please, and the holdings at this time, so I can be accurate in my description to the socialist? And he spent about 5 minutes and wrote some notes down and wrote some figures down. And so again, the socialist was demanding, I want my fair share of the money that's rightfully mine, even though you made it. You earned it. And so I said, okay. And so I got a number now, and I waited for the moment, and then the socialist came up to me and said, well, Mr. Carnegie, what did you come back? How much are you going to give me? And I said, well, young man, I looked at the population of the United States, and I said to my secretary, give this man 16 cents. That's his share of my wealth. Well, that didn't satisfy that socialist at all. So, where did my idea of giving money away come from? I decided I'd become friends with a sociologist by the name of Herbert Spencer. He came up with an idea of the survival of the fittest. Have you heard of that? Now, most people associate that with Charles Darwin, but Herbert Spencer was the author of the idea of survival of the fittest. That is, the fittest survive, and then by having children, they pass on those genes to other children because they become better and better people, stronger, healthier, smarter. And so I was beginning to believe that. And I read everything that Spencer wrote and talked about. And so this is where I started thinking about, I have all this money, $480 million. What am I going to do with all that money? And I decided, you know, by the way, I quit attending, I told you I was not a Presbyterian anymore. I was going to a church in New York called the Swedenborgism. The Swedenborg religion was a very interesting religion. It's Christian, but they are very works-oriented. And so a lot of people have asked me how I got into the philanthropy business, and I probably would say to them, even though at the time I didn't realize it, that I was probably in this mindset that for me to save my soul would be to give my money to people who needed it. And I got to the point was, not only did I want to give my money and valuables to people that needed it, but the people that deserved it because they worked hard. I'm not just going to hand it just to anybody. You're going to have to ask for it, and you're going to have to deserve it. You're going to have to work for it. And so that was one of the beginning ideas of my philanthropy ideas. And so I decided, and my basic philosophy statement was this: the man who dies rich dies disgraced. And I was determined not to be disgraced. So I decided to write an article, which was published, called The Gospel of Wealth. You could probably see it here in this library. If you want to read that, many of you are probably extremely wealthy. will want to think about your giving away funds and how should you do it appropriately. And so I decided in this article, The Gospel of Wealth, there are 3 appropriate ways of disposing of excess wealth. Now mind you, I have a wife, and Louise, and a daughter, Margaret. I have 1 daughter. And so obviously if I pass on, I'm going to leave something for them. But I'm not going to give them $480 million, okay? That's not going to happen. So the 3 things you would think about when you are disposing of your wealth would be, number 1, you would leave it to your descendants, which I rejected. Number 2, you would give money to public institutions after you die. You would put it in a trust or something, and they would turn around and give money to the library or to a theater or whatever. I rejected that one. Nope, don't want to do that. The third one is to administer that money, giving that money away while you are alive. And I said, that's it. I want to do that. And so then the question was, what do I give my money to? And so here is the order in my mind that I was thinking about what I'm going to do to give this money away. The first people I want to give money to, I know what you're going to say. You think libraries are first. No. Universities. Places of research and study and reading. Second, libraries. Third, medical centers. Fourth, public parks. Fifth, concert halls and public baths. And if I had anything left over, the church. Now, time of wealth and corruption and political craziness, he was still really pretty well down to earth and a remarkable human being. So I've been impressed with it. Did a lot of fun reading about it. I hope you enjoyed my attempt to my presentation. I have a handout for you. Jessica printed off something of some of the resources I've read to get to this point. There are books on juvenile. If you go on the website and type in Andrew Carnegie, you're going to find all kinds of things. You look at Carnegie Mellon, you look at Carnegie Hall, all kinds of things that Carnegie is all over the place. He's just been a remarkable human being. Any other questions for the good evening?
Do you have any knowledge of another humanities program coming into Norfolk in the next week or so?
Any other, you mentioned a humanities program that's coming in?
June 25th, we'll
June
have
25th?
the history through fashion.
History
Yeah, I
through
don't know
fashion.
of anything